Hello and welcome to episode 15 of Criminal Profiling. We're still looking into the life of Bryan Kohberger. As most of you know, there's a gag order presently in place. Today's date is February 12th, 2023. It's going to be a few months now before anything really gets underway. Last episode, we covered some details about the case, details I had pulled from the internet and from various sources. However, when it comes to employing profiling methods, we have very little to go on because we need things that are verified and 100% so that we too can achieve that kind of accuracy. Although we heard from various ex-classmates and students and ex-co-workers of what they thought of Bryan, we wouldn't generally use that in our work as profilers. It is not unusual for someone to step up and want to say something about someone just to get themselves on TV. So often you'll hear a lot of rubbish. And even if someone steps forward and says, Bryan touched me inappropriately on the job or did this or that, we would want to see corroborating evidence, such as a paper trail of the complaint of said incident. So as I mentioned in the last episode, the only thing we really have to go on that's really solid is some information that has come out concerning the actual crime scene. The stabbing, the defensive wounds, the likelihood that some or all were sleeping at the time of the attack. We also know there was multiple stab wounds and that the attack was aggressive and vicious. We also know that it was not a clean crime scene, that there was cross-contamination between rooms. It was haphazard, unprofessional. We've heard about the knife sheath, the DNA, the traffic pullovers. We've heard about the telephone pings, and now we're also hearing that there could possibly have been a Bluetooth active at the time, which may have recorded information that could potentially link Bryan to the crime scene. People magazine claimed that Bryan followed all three victims on Instagram and messaged one of the victims several times. Based on school records, we know that Bryan has an interest in psychology or criminal justice. Although we don't have a time of birth, so we don't know what's going on with the 7th house of Libra, we can take note of certain outstanding combinations. One of the more outstanding combinations involves the Sun, Pluto, and Jupiter, which are all in conjunct aspect with each other. This forms a small stellium, or cluster of planets, and it is in the sign Scorpio. And Scorpio, as a sign, rules psychologist, psychoanalyst, detective. Also in Scorpio, though not part of the stellium just mentioned, is Mercury. And Mercury rules communications, and so it would reflect where someone's interests might lie. Law itself is ruled by Libra and Sagittarius, and you would also include Jupiter, the ruling planet for Sagittarius, in that lineup. Because Bryan has 5 planets in Scorpio, and some of those planets are very strong planets, namely the Sun, Mercury, and Jupiter, Venus, these very strong planets mean that it's going to be a little bit easier for us to interpret Bryan because he'll be more focused in the area of Scorpio than any other. And he's got that stellium in Scorpio, which is going to concentrate the energy there as well. So we can expect maybe some very pronounced Scorpio traits from this man. There could be the presence of intense emotions, controlling emotional nature. We can certainly expect to see anger issues with the individual in this chart, Bryan. And this is because of the 4 planets, the Sun, Pluto, Jupiter, and Mercury in Scorpio are all squared to Mars in Leo. And Leo is the sign of romance and romantic partners. Coldness and bitterness and possibly cruelty can come out of the Sun square Mars and Sun square Saturn combination, especially when you consider the Sun is in Scorpio, which is a water sign reflecting the emotions, and Saturn itself is in Pisces, another water sign reflecting the emotions. Some of the words reflecting Scorpio are tenacious, organized, active, passionate, penetrating, and intense. I think many of the photos and the comments that many people have made, especially from the casual observers who don't know Bryan, and talk about his intense staring and how uncomfortable it can make you. I think this stare is actually captured in a few of the pictures that just stands right out. And the reason is because of those 5 planets in Scorpio build the energy up considerably. And while it does make him more intelligent, especially with the stellium, it also will bring out to the forefront these traits of Scorpio that will be very noticeable. This is an individual who may look for absolute control, and that is because of Jupiter, the planet of expansion, is conjunct Pluto in Scorpio, and the fact that he has the Sun square Saturn, giving these personality traits of restriction and control, as well as Mars being in square aspect to Pluto. We expect Bryan to be a fairly organized person who would be involved in planning if he was, in fact, the guilty party. And the reason is because of, primarily Scorpio. There are 5 planets in Scorpio. Scorpio is a sign which carries organizational abilities as one of its traits. We have the Sun, Pluto in Scorpio. The Sun is square Saturn, giving it structure. We have Jupiter and Mercury in Scorpio. Mercury ruling the mental mind, the mental thinking mind. Jupiter, higher education. And Venus is also in Scorpio, giving an attraction towards things that are of a Scorpio nature. It also could give an attraction towards or a preference for being organized. And it could reflect that his tastes are a little picky. When we consider Pluto, especially the Sun conjunct Pluto, Mars square Pluto, and Jupiter conjunct Pluto, this is someone whose philosophies might include changing the world or wanting to have an effect so large that it does change the world or affects the world. And they may see serial or mass murder as one way that this can be achieved. There's likely going to be a great deal of impatience or the building up of energy that is almost explosive in nature. And this is because of the 4 squares to Mars, right? As well as the Sun square Saturn, because Saturn wants to hold back. Bryan is prone to blurting things out of anger or speaking before thinking, although because of his Mercury being in Scorpio, it helps to keep this in check a little bit, being more tenacious. Therefore, although Scorpio rules secretiveness and people who may be secretive, his Mercury square Mars and Mercury conjunct Jupiter are bound to cause him to give away those secrets. He is not likely a good secret keeper. Generally speaking, one with Mercury square Mars and conjunct Jupiter would talk too much and have the danger of saying too much during an interrogation. And if Bryan is indeed guilty, he certainly played his cards right. But that, of course, is reflective of his degree in psychology and his degree in criminal justice. He knows what to do. The chart does reflect someone who's not that easy to get along with. In spite of the Sun conjunct Jupiter, there's so much of a problem with the Sun square Mars, Mercury square Mars, Sun square Saturn, and Sun conjunct Pluto. The Sun conjunct Pluto will come into it eventually in the worst way because of the square to the Mars. He's bound to just act out and not really care what the other person feels for that moment, perhaps, with the Sun square Saturn. Pluto has that tendency to want to control others or to remake them or to make them do what they want. The chart also reflects one with a tendency to have strong opinions and whatnot, and philosophies, if not a tendency towards the religious. Any one of those or a combination. And this is reflected in the chart with such combinations as the Sun and Mercury in Scorpio conjunct Jupiter. Bryan's chart reveals someone who would undoubtedly want to push and would push their philosophies or beliefs onto you. And they would have that tinge to it, that religious or philosophical bent to it. And this is seen with the Mercury conjunct Jupiter, Mercury being the communicator, and Mercury square Mars, the planet of war, as well as Mars, the planet of war, square Jupiter, his philosophies. We can then go a step further and note that Jupiter, the philosophies, is in conjunct aspect with Pluto. And this is a philosophy that might want to change the world or affect many people on many different levels and not just a singular person. They want to make a name for themselves, perhaps, that sort of thing, and become renowned. The Sun and its aspects reveals, perhaps, is most revealing of just how potentially dangerous this person can be. With the Sun square Mars, the Sun conjunct Pluto, those two things alone are seeking to remake people and can get violent and very violent and take things to the extreme. The Sun square Saturn is part of that combination and can reveal one who is unempathetic to others and cut off from others, perhaps. And this allows an individual to do horrific things to others without conscience. The multiple squares to Mars reveal someone who is prone to taking things too far, and this could very well be his downfall, is not thinking things through and acting physically impulsively, and which could lead to error. And this is shown by the multiple squares to Mars, as well as the Mars in conjunct Uranus especially. The combination of the Sun and Mercury conjunct Jupiter reveals that Bryan could in fact come across to others as kind and considerate and highly intelligent. So this is the chart of someone whose philosophies and beliefs are tied in directly with their anger and the desire to remake others towards their philosophies or beliefs. While Bryan's philosophies may certainly be intellectual and complex, perhaps, the tendency towards remaking others or controlling others is almost certainly going to rear its ugly head due to the very strong aspects of Mars square Jupiter and Jupiter conjunct Pluto. Returning to the crime itself, what do we have as astrological criminal profilers? Well, we have Mars. We still have Mars, but not much else. We have enough to go on because of the use of the knife, the manner in which the crime was played out, to know that Mars is outstanding. But we don't have enough to go on for Pluto to say that this guy wanted to change the world or anything like that. We just don't have enough proof in that direction where we can start separating suspects. Nor do we have enough proof really just by having the detective say, oh, this looks like a planned hit. This person likely knew them or stalked them, and it was a personal thing because of the knife, etc., and the way in which the whole thing was carried out. We aren't finished with Mars yet. We still need to consider the anger issues and bad temper that seems to be coming out as more and more people step up and want to share information they know or claim to know about Bryan. Based on what we've heard regarding his contentious relations with coworkers, being fired because of that, and other anger issue related instances that people are talking about, we wouldn't separate suspects based on that kind of testimony. What we would do is we would use more of the anger as shown at the actual crime scene, the knife used, the anger displayed when the crime was taking place. That is how we could separate suspects utilizing Mars. Insofar as others' testimonies is concerned, you would take that information as tentative and not put too much weight on it unless it's been absolutely verified. But you could use it to help stay on track if you think a certain person is the offender you're looking for, in this case Bryan, then you could use it as sort of a supporting testimony in your case. Another important consideration, and I think it's probably a good time to bring it up, is the fact that there was no sexual interaction between the perpetrator and any of the victims. But this could have been for a number of reasons. The perpetrator might have planned on having sexual relations with one or more of the victims, but things just didn't go as smoothly as he had hoped. Perhaps he heard the noise from those who were downstairs unharmed and thought, I have to get out of here, and he just cut it short. There could be any number of reasons, so it's impossible to draw any definite conclusion on that. However, on that note, and just speculating, we can take a look at Bryan's chart and we can notice that, well, the moon trine Venus may not be active because we don't have a time of birth, so we can't actually use it. That leaves us with one aspect, and that is Venus trine Saturn. This is a positive aspect. It doesn't help us much in spite of the fact that Venus is in Scorpio, and Venus has attractions and courtships, and Scorpio rules sex. It is still not really standoutish. It's got Venus trine Saturn, which makes it kind of blah. On the other hand, this does correspond with the crime scene itself, because there was no sex and only anger displayed with the use of the knife and the close personal contact with the victims. Bryan's chart reflects that. It reflects more of that anger and absolute control and maybe lashing out than it does sexual motivation. This is not to say that had he been able to spend ample time with the victims, that sex wouldn't have occurred. It's just that the crime scene itself, at least this particular one, told a different story. As an aside, for those who have wondered about the students who mentioned Bryan as being a loner in various programs, that would be reflected by the Sun square Saturn. I'm just going to recap on a few areas of Bryan's chart. Insofar as his intelligence is concerned, we wouldn't normally know that, what his intelligence is per se, just by looking at a chart. Because we won't know whether that person had the opportunity to get the education required to take advantage of these potentials. It would be very difficult for Bryan to be diplomatic or a mediator because of his Mercury square Mars. Would not allow that. It's just, if you're looking at a chart like this, you're going to know just looking at it, this guy can be blunt, can be crude, can be bold in speech and in mannerisms in this case. He can be cold and indifferent considering the Sun square Saturn. But what stands out most strongly by far is the need to control. And while there is an ability to conceal that, especially considering the Sun and Mercury conjunct Jupiter, it won't be long before the anger shows through and the other traits come shining through. This is the chart of someone you would expect to have a lot of past contentious relations with various people. For Bryan, power and control is seen throughout his chart, throughout many combinations. A few examples are the stellium, found in Scorpio, consisting of the Sun conjunct Jupiter conjunct Pluto, also the Sun square Saturn, the Sun conjunct Pluto, Mercury square Mars, Mars square Jupiter, Mars in conjunct Uranus, and Mars square Pluto. Keep in mind that Mars is in Leo, the sign of the ego and of romantic partners, and Mars itself forms one of the most dangerous aspects with Mars square Pluto, and Pluto being in Scorpio, which itself does present us with the idea of revenge or possessiveness, jealousy, control. Being a true Scorpion, Bryan may wish to remain secretive and not let out too much information. The need to gain notoriety is possible. Hatred towards the opposite sex is possible. And this is seen reflected in the chart in combinations such as the 4 squares made to Mars, Jupiter conjunct Pluto in Scorpio. So in closing, we can certainly say that Bryan's chart reflects the MO of the crime itself. The use of the knife and the violence involved in the crime itself, Mars was the best representative. The attack itself wasn't spontaneous enough to involve Uranus, such as in the case with Richard Speck, and the attack on the victims was more Mars-like than it was Pluto. With Pluto, you generally get deeper cuts, you get mutilations, decapitations, amputations, and things can be taken to the extremes. In closing, were this an actual case, we still only have one planet we can use from which to separate suspects, and that planet is Mars. And again, that is due to the MO of the crime, the use of the knife, etc. Even if you use the testimonies of others at a particular company where you had the boss and several employees who could attest and give their own descriptions of Bryan's contentious relationships, it would still draw you back to Mars, because you wouldn't actually pick a Mercury and Mars necessarily just because they're communicating in an angry, contentious way, because you can get that same effect from Jupiter and Mars. So really, you'd be back to Mars. On the other hand, the contentious relations at work further supports your case for separating suspects based on Mars. We cannot use Bryan's schooling as a way to separate suspects because the schooling that he did take, the psychology and the criminal justice, can be reflected in many different planetary sign combinations. So we couldn't narrow it down to a specific planet or sign, which we would have to be able to do in order to separate suspects. That concludes this episode on Bryan. We may return to Bryan once further information comes through, perhaps, or when the courts start up. So until then, take care.